In this presentation, we'll turn to a region where we haven't spent much time until now. That is, Russia. One of the reasons that we haven't spent as much time in Russia is because the musical tradition, all the way back to chant, is very different. Remember that when the Catholic Church split, or the early Christian church split, we get an Eastern church and a Western church. That Eastern church has an Orthodox tradition. We have the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox tradition. And from that springs an entirely different chant tradition and a different philosophy regarding music in worship that also affects how music interacts with folk music and eventually concert music. We'll see this come to a head in a city called St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is a coastal city, and because of that, and because of its proximity to regions like Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and because of an easy reach out into the Baltic Sea to reach Northern Europe and regions like France and Germany, make it one of the cities that begins to be westernized, to have influence from Western Europe. And thus we'll see some composers who utilize Western techniques and other composers who push back against these techniques and want to just be Russian composers. In the 19th century, Russia is caught between opposing forces of tradition and modernization. These are the westernization, 19th century Russia is caught between opposing forces of tradition and modernization, between westernization and nationalists. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II, pictured here, frees the serfs. Serfs is another term for peasants, and begins a campaign to modernize Russia. During this time, the nationalists, or Slavophiles, sought to keep Russia's identity as they saw it. Meanwhile, the internationalists wanted to westernize, to adopt the Western education systems. St. Petersburg, in particular, became a hotbed of nationalist versus internationalist conflict, due largely to its proximity to other nations and it being a port city. We'll look first at Peter Tchaikovsky, who studied at the St. Petersburg Conservatory and taught at the Moscow Conservatory, and even visited Peabody. Though he incorporates Russian literature, for instance, Pushkin's Eugene Onegin in 1879, which also includes folk-like tunes, much of his music displays more Western elements in their classical forms and genre. For instance, consider not only the traditional scope of his violin concerto, but also the very title of the movements, which are in Italian. So here we have a fast, slow, fast structure, extraordinarily classical, all the way, referencing all the way back to Vivaldi's Baroque concerto styles. But the music itself also feels very European. It feels learned and from the classical and early Romantic styles of Western Europe. Here we'll listen to a little bit of Jascha Heifetz performing the first movement of Peter Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto. Opposing the conservatory-trained, westernized musicians were the traditionalists and nationalists. The Mighty Five, or the Mighty Handful, were a group of traditionalist composers in St. Petersburg who incorporated Russian folk song as well as modal and exotic scales into their music as a way to make it seem more Russian. Among these were Mile Balakirev, who is the only quote-unquote trained musician in the group. He was their unofficial leader. There was Alexander Borodin, a chemist who used Russian folk song in his operas, Cesar Cui, who composed 14 operas, Modest Mussorgsky, whose well-known works include Boris Godunov, an opera, and Pictures at an Exhibition. He wrote the piano version, which was later orchestrated by a number of different composers. And Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who studied with Balakirev and eventually became a professor at St. Petersburg Conservatory. There, he taught Glazunov and Stravinsky. We're going to look a little bit at Rimsky-Korsakov's opera Sadko. Here, the composer illustrates the tale of a minstrel who impresses the sea czar with his music. Now, that sounds like a pun in English. Tsar actually comes from the Latin word Caesar, from Caesar Augustus, and that's where the ruling name Tsar comes from. In this case, it simply means sea king. What's interesting here for me, as someone who likes mythologies, is that we once again have a minstrel who descends to the depths to impress a deity or a king. It's very much like Orpheus. In this second scene, the music of the minstrel evokes pentatonicism and peasant song. It's slightly pentatonic, slightly modal. Meanwhile, however, the magic kingdom of the Sea King is represented by what's called the octatonic scale. An octatonic scale has 8 pitches. And if you think about our diatonic scale, that only has 7 pitches. Think of a C major scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then the pitches start over. So there's 7 distinct pitches. The octatonic scale has 8 distinct pitches. It is made up of alternating half steps and whole steps. You can either start with a whole step and then proceed whole, half, or you can start with a half step and proceed half, whole, half, whole. Don't say half whole real fast or else you'll insult someone. So here we see that we start on an E. The octatonic scale that's being used here is E, F sharp, that's a whole step, then F sharp to G, G, A, B flat, C, C sharp, D, E, G, E, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C, C sharp, D sharp, E. I got a little turned around there. And we hear it implied from the very beginning. The interesting thing about the octatonic scale is that it enfolds within itself 2 fully diminished 7th chords. And that's what we'll hear at the beginning. We'll hear a fully diminished 7th chord arpeggiated in the bass line, but harmonized with chords from the octatonic scale collection. This octatonic scale represents magic. It represents an other world. Meanwhile, the pentatonicism and modality represent the real world, but also importantly, the Russian folk tradition.